The most dinged standard of all of the SACS principles, it's 3.5.1. The institution identifies college level general education competencies and the extent to which graduates have attained them. And that's why as we've gone through, I'm going to skip ahead, as we've gone through in the seminar series to talk about some of these different measures that we're beginning to look into or that we have already been doing, because really the only new ones are the top two. All of these are things we've already been doing the whole time. But you will see that the focus, if you recall, was usually on end of experience students first. And the reason for that was because we know we have to show evidence that graduates have attained the core competencies. So we want to make sure that we have that kind of information available to us when it comes time to write that up. And then the 4 core competencies that were approved in Faculty Senate were master the depth of knowledge required for a discipline, critical analytical skills, communicating effectively and speaking and writing, and providing ethical leadership in a global and diverse society. Now then, we have developed some questions for the panel, and we will allow the panelists, we'll encourage our panelists to respond from their unique perspectives within the university. So the first question is, what is the best way for the Core Curriculum Council to be involved in core competency assessment? I do not have a particular order for this panel, but it does seem like Doug Slack may want to start.
Well, there are a lot of ways I think 3 years ago we could have been involved, but the Faculty Senate has kind of changed the landscape for the Core Curriculum Council. 2 years ago we wanted to do something as simple as evaluating and recertifying courses, which led to a major upheaval in the Faculty Senate over the thought that someone would recertify a course for the core curriculum. And I think Dr. Gunn was involved with that and tried to lead that charge and came away with his knees buckled. And so we decided that we had to back off a little bit of that kind of re-review of courses. And then some colleges, we did that after some colleges had submitted an incredible amount of paperwork. I think in seeing the role that the Core Curriculum Council has played, which is mostly approving courses and adding courses to the core curriculum, that I think the best, and that led to a when we had to decide how we were going to evaluate general education, we were part of the group that was very happy that we were not going to evaluate course by course by course of those courses in the core curriculum. Rather, we were going to look at a university level programmatic approach, those 4 questions that you saw a couple slides ago. And I think the best role, as I can see it, as the chair of this committee, one who's taken a lot of heat on decisions in the last year and a half, the best role that we can play is to be a liaison to assessment at the university level in helping give ideas on ways we can close the loop. So if on some of these in that larger chart that you showed us just the last slide back, if we find we're not doing a very job in improving students' understanding and empathy towards different cultural groups, well, maybe we can look at the structure of the international and cultural diversity courses and make some changes there and recommend changes in that category. If we're not doing a very good job in analytical thinking and in problem solving, maybe we can work in our capacity to give some advice to the assessment committee on ways to enhance courses, not to dictate, because faculty members are very unhappy about dictating what will be in their courses, but at least some ideas on ways to improve structurally a category in courses. So I think it's more of an advise the assessment process. Anybody have anything that they think we ought to be doing?
Are we just going along? Full disclosure, I am going to say more than once that closing the loop should really be closing the loops. I think, it's not one loop, it's lots of loops all the time, and that we don't often do a very good job of that. And that's actually something Doug said, I think, is really right with the Core Curriculum Council. I think one real problem at the university has been the Walford chart, right? We are all working at cross purposes all the time, and people are on committees and have never heard of what other committees have done, and we get full reports and sets of recommendations, and then nobody ever follows up on them. So I really think one of the issues, especially for the Core Curriculum Council, which is this particular question, is to coordinate a lot better. And this works more than one way, right? It's not just the Curriculum Council's responsibility to seek out the rest of it, but it's everybody's responsibility to stay in touch, because most of the, Doug didn't mention that I'm one of the ones who's given him grief over the years, and I think one reason for that is it often looks as if nobody has ever even bothered to see what's going on anywhere else. So we end up getting decisions made that don't actually coordinate with others. So I think coordination is my big statement for this particular slide.
I think from the standpoint of engineering, we, at least for the most part, primarily the faculty I'm speaking of, probably don't have a clue what core curriculum requirements are, and would just as well ignore what they are because they're so focused on all of the engineering preparatory courses, the courses that are, for example, at a higher level, so that in the core curriculum there may be a requirement of math, there may be some requirement for English, some requirement for communication. In particular the hard sciences, though, engineers feel like, well, we're way beyond that. We're going to need calculus 3, differential equations, physics, this and that, and whatever. And so there probably isn't, the core curriculum probably viewed as a kind of a nuisance, if I can put it that way. It's probably because we're so narrow focused. We're really focused on the engineering stuff, the science stuff. I would agree that from an engineering standpoint, I really, when I first started looking at this and looking at ABET outcomes, which are 11 in number, I think it's 11, A through K, whatever that is. If A through K is 11, then it's 11. How those mapped into the gen ed requirements, and strangely enough, it maps quite well. It's a very interesting thing. You can see how gen ed really does prepare students for engineering. One thing I would second, though, is the communication and the coordination. It seems to be that the level of communication that we have had from up to down, sideways, any which way you want to look at it, has been basically very small, either by design or simply just by the fact that nobody was really interested in some cases. In the world of ABET, we have to show with direct evidence, and we have to close the loop that shows that by the time students graduate, they have satisfied A through K outcomes, these 11 outcomes. It actually turns out you can map these fairly well to the 4 gen ed components. And while we don't spend a whole lot at the time trying to assess things at the lower level, simply because ABET says we must show that students understand these things at the time of graduation. So what happens at the freshman year, it doesn't necessarily get assessed in much of any way, simply because if we did, ABET would tell us, well, that's wonderful, but what did they do when they graduated? Having said all of that, though, I think the problem is we all know in engineering that the math, the science, the writing skills, all of these things are extremely, extremely important to the success of a student, not only while in school, but certainly once they get out in the real world. And it used to be that it seems like we had a lot of communication with the science department, physics, math, so forth, even the English department. I can tell you now that it's really hard. As part of my ABET work, I have to go get syllabi for all of these support courses. It's like dragging, I mean, it's like pulling teeth. I just cannot even get somebody to give me a syllabus. That's how much cooperation we have on just these little simple things, much less the course content or how we could feed back information to someone who's teaching writing. Hey, based on our observation, you probably need to be doing something different. Those kind of lines of communications really need to be upgraded to a point where they really do work, because it seems to me right now it's about dead as far as I can tell.
Okay, I'm going to let Lorraine go to the next question.
Yes, ma'am. How does this process complement the academic master plan and the teaching and learning roadmap?
Okay. And as a newly identified co-chair of that committee, I get to talk about that today in connection with, I think, the core curriculum council issues. I have a tendency to look at things from a lot of different perspectives, and one perspective of the fact that we have all these thousands of different ways of looking at gen ed outcomes and core curriculum and that kind of thing is the evidence that everybody thinks it's important, or at least a lot of groups think that it's important. And just because they're talking about it in an unconnected manner doesn't make it less important to each of the groups that's talking about it. So I see the teaching and learning roadmap issue as we have a specific charge, which is to identify learning outcomes and experiences for Texas A&M graduates and to suggest some methodologies for causing those to happen. That's not really a new kind of thing. But underlying that, I think, is the mission to try to connect all the things that have been done and put them in a reasonable picture so that everyone sort of sees how they're connected, kind of like what Walt did with ABET and the general education outcomes. You know, we can do that with everything that's out there so far. Trying to do it in a way that makes sense and is useful, I think, is the task. I've also learned in just a couple of meetings that I've been on this committee and in the assessment that closing the loop or closing the loops doesn't always mean figuring out the answer. Sometimes it's just, what do we do next? And I think we lose sight of that sometimes, and we have these tremendous number of layers of addressing the learning outcomes. We have a university level where it applies to everybody, and every degree plan has to buy in, and every college has to see where they, can connect to these. And then we have college levels where the departments are trying to fit together, and the colleges will have different perspectives. And then we have the department level, and then we have the actual individual student level. And so we can't ignore any of those levels either, but they have to be connected, and we have to be able to see how they flow together in the system. And finally, I think one of the new issues that's come up in the teaching and learning roadmap is the fact that nearly every list that we've looked at, the ones that are on Weave Online, other kinds of lists of outcomes, are really built around undergraduate education. And when you try to start connecting graduate outcomes to those lists, it's hard, very, very difficult. And so one of the things that I think is growing out of this bigger look at how to assess, and first of all, how to express what you're going to assess, is how do we express what we want the outcomes for our graduate students to be as well, which right now I would say in general is they successfully defend their dissertation, period. So to try to break that out into more identifiable skills and issues. One other thing I'd like to say about what's going on in the connection between the teaching learning roadmap ideas and all of these other issues is again, as Walt pointed out, the ease in which the things that have been talked about and identified can be mapped onto these 4 approved by the Faculty Senate outcomes. But what we've also learned is that they may need to be parsed out a little bit, that the big ones can be broken into pieces and may need to be assessed in different ways. And so there may be some elaboration that comes out of this group for looking at each of these 4 big areas.
And as I think about it, it's really more like keep the spiral going, because sometimes people interpret that to mean we've closed it, we're done, we put it aside, we're finished, instead of, okay, well, we tried that and that was great, but let's refine it a little bit. Let's figure out what we might want to do slightly differently next time, and then build that into the next cycle of the assessment plan. And one thing I've been emphasizing with faculty as I've been talking to them and with department heads a lot is this doesn't stop. Like, don't think of this as the thing that you're just going to get finished and then be done with. That's not the way it works. Like, the whole idea is to see what happened, figure out what was going right, what was going wrong, shift into second gear for the next time around, and then move forward again. And that it is kind of always in process and not a completed task or something. So,
Any other questions about this?
Just one other comment, and keep track of all those things. Yeah. I think that's where we are at this point in our process, is how do we keep track of those thoughts and process.
Metrics. What's that really mean, and how does that sort of work?
That metrics are expected at some point in time. Essentially, what we know that metrics are, some way of determining whether outcomes are being achieved and methodologies are being implemented, but it probably will not happen in this first year of work. So I think that's
when we're assessing at the roadmap level. One common way to think about that is a series of skills that people are supposed to possess and what's inside people's heads, which is reasonable. We're a teaching institution. Other way people can think of universities is, say, preparing workers for a labor market, integrating them into community and life outcomes that occur after graduation. Are those currently under consideration by the Roadmap Committee, or are we pretty much kind of narrowly at the cognitive level?
I think it's interesting that you asked that question, because I think that's one of the things that has come up in the discussions. And I'll just, full disclosure, I'm actually from a public school background, and so I've been talking from assessment for much longer than the higher ed people have. And when you start talking about the measurements, it really begins to diminish the things that you want to look at. And so in trying to push beyond just the skill level, we're beginning to look at what you might call theoretical frameworks for organizing the skills, so that you see how certain skills are put into a package to reach a goal for longer learning or more involvement once you graduate. So I think it's a packaging kind of thing that we're pushing, or investigating. But we're still at the development stage.
Other comments on this question?
Well, I would hasten to add, as a member of that committee, that I think the experience that I've had, the experiences over the last 3 or 4 years, is continued communication is absolutely critical. And communication between the Roadmap Committee and this office in this effort, because superficially you can almost see 2 tracks going. A track, the Office of Institutional Assessment, and a teaching roadmap track moving. And then when SACS comes and reviews, if we're not careful, we'll have one set of outcomes that we haven't really looked at, another set of outcomes that we've got a database, a Weave Online database that discusses those outcomes. We just need to make sure as a university community that there's a lot of cross-fertilization. And I would say communication also with the faculty. Faculty members are like my old speech teacher. You've got to tell them what's going on. You've got to explain it, maybe 3 times explain it. Then you got to tell them what they were told before they're willing to vote in a rational manner. And not that faculty vote irrationally, but it's been my experience that they vote in surprising ways to such good sounding things as institutional assessment. I mean, who can be opposed to that? No one's really opposed to it unless it means doing something in their office or in their course or take away from their research time or what have you. So we have to be really careful. Faculty members are brought along on both this assessment effort out of your office, Lorraine, as well as teaching a learning roadmap.
I will assure you, we're very interested in making sure we collaborate. There was another thing you said I wanted to correct that is important in this notion of coordination and communication. In an earlier comment you said, and the assessment committee, amidst your comments. And Texas A&M does not have an assessment committee. We have some assessment liaisons that are all awesome and do great work and coordinate with us to try and make things happen in the college. We have some liaisons to educational support. One of them's here, Kristen Harper. And there's a few others, though it's not comprehensive enough yet for us to be successful in a 2012 visit. But there isn't an assessment committee. And so that's not actually an avenue we have here to use to coordinate. We just rely on the good faith of our liaisons.
More on that later in a final slide. That was one of the things I was going to say. But this is, I think, for you, Janie, mostly as the person on the roadmap committee. It's time for the alignment word, and I think one thing I would like to see, and if you can advocate for this, it'd be great, is for all of the roadmap committees to try to line up better so that it's not just research, spirals out here in some universe, and then, there's a whole different one that's for teaching. Those things go together. If we can get all of them headed toward, research has to do with inquiry-based learning and experts in classrooms and blah, blah, and, the engagement roadmap has to do with integrative learning, which has to do with research. If we can get those things to all kind of talk to each other, I think that'd be good.
Doug, I have to make a comment on one thing that you said about assessment at the university level and how no one can really be against it. It all sounds wonderful. I would agree with you up to a point. One of the issues that we have in engineering, of course, we're accredited. Each program is separately accredited, professional accreditation. And so one of the things that we just somehow have to figure out how to make all this work is that once the faculty have gone through professional accreditation, they somehow feel, well, we've done our part. We've done it probably a lot better than the university is doing it. And therefore, why do we have to do it a second time? And so I know Lorraine has been very sensitive to this, trying to find ways that will take what we have done and cast it into the form that's required for Weave Online and other things. There's always the issue of terminology. Language is different. ABET has very specific definitions of things, which are almost always counter to somebody else's definition. In some cases, the faculty are very supportive of this, but they do also sort of look at it as just another make-do task that has to be sort of checked off. And, of course, when you sit on both sides of the fence, you have to kind of, be careful about what you say because, I have to sort of tell them you must do it because Lorraine said you must do it, or you must do it because ABET said you must do it, and then I sit on the other side of the fence as a faculty member saying, hey, this is taking a lot of my time. So we have to look at assessment. It has to be value added. We can't assess everything that walks and breathes and moves around this campus. We just have to be selective so that when we do assessment of whatever it is, that it's really something that's producing some good and not just some entropy generator. It means lost energy for non-engineers.
Yeah, I sort of started that in the Teaching and Learning Roadmap Committee. There's some discussion about expanding or identifying learning outcomes for graduate programs. And one of the things I want to highlight, Doug, that you mentioned about crosswalks between assessment and what's going on in the Teaching and Learning Committee. Before I came on to replace Lori Jager as co-chair, the co-chairs of that committee had actually gotten with Lorraine and pulled all of the student learning outcomes off of Weave Online from, I mean, every one and in undergraduate and graduate programs, and generated a discussion list of larger outcomes from those lists. So in reality, the things that are coming out of the Teaching and Learning Roadmap Committee have come from the outcomes that at least the assessment people have entered. There's always a question about how much faculty input there was into those things, but that's where they came from, in addition to the lists that were already generated and then some connection. So I'm saying this because we then had, undergraduate ones to map them onto, but the graduate list is fairly a new list. But again, it's been created from what was on the Weave Online program plans. And so I think you'll see it as an interesting list, which is going to be finalized in the next couple of weeks, I guess.
I don't have a good answer for this.
I took the undergraduate 4 outcomes and marched around the top floor of my building with faculty members and gave them a 1-minute briefing on outcomes, and then said, how do you think this fits for graduate education? And they were surprisingly, they thought those were outcomes that graduate students. Now, what the committee came up with is a little, breaking some up a little bit and expanding them, which is surely. And so I think it fits, communications and analysis and global diverse communities. All of those things fit in very nicely into a graduate program. So I was very comfortable. Some people get hit in the face with something cold, didn't revulse and say, oh, heavens, no. So that's good.
I'm going to put on my liberal arts trained as a humanist hat and say sometimes a thing that people forget at Texas A&M in general is that there are things called the humanities and the arts. And one thing that's really, and there are some very different kinds of outcomes expected, especially of graduate students in those circumstances. So for example, you can sit at any table of any size with any number of people, and pretty much everyone will agree that teamwork is a really important outcome. And I always have to raise my hand at that point and say, if you are a graduate student in English or in philosophy or in history, you need to go hide in a cubby somewhere with a big stack of books and get your work done. All by yourself. That is, you ask you sort of come out of hiding every now and then and ask a couple of questions and then go back. So we need to think, I think one thing is that graduate programs are a lot more varied in terms of what they are training their graduate students to do, educating their graduate students to do. And so for us to just keep that in mind, there are master's programs that are deliberately master's programs. They're not consolation prizes for the people who didn't get to the PhD. They may be helping people in the classroom, K through 12 classrooms get better status and salaries. They may be for people who want to go out and be, editors or performers or Publishers, they don't want PhDs, and that's not what we're trying to educate people to do. Clinical psychologists are not going to do the same kind of research that a research neuroscientist does. So, just to kind of remember that there are some really different things going on, I think, with graduates.
So I think the challenge is, as with the undergraduate program, is to figure out how to articulate goals or objectives for everyone that allows for those differences.
How can those involved effectively coordinate to assess the core competencies and close the loop?
Well, it's back to what we've said, lots of communication and a lot of interaction. I think it's also a realization of how all of these things interact. And if you could, Lorraine, before you walk away, plop up that Word document. Because the business of coordination, it's, if you know what's involved, you can sort of coordinate it, but if you don't really realize how connected it is, then it's hard to coordinate. I think you have a handout, if I'm not mistaken. It's a table there. Just scroll up a little bit. Yeah, it's sort of a mapping. Go down a little bit. That's perfect. So it's a mapping between ABET program outcomes, A through K, and the TAMU general education competencies. There's a lot of things you can say about that, but let me just point out a few which are really very interesting. If you look at the items on the left, you will see that 5 of them are what I would call the hard sciences. That is, their mathematics, physics, laboratory work, yada, yada. 6 of them are what we would call soft stuff. Teaming, learning how to work in teams, communication, lifelong learning, knowledge of contemporary issues, all of these sort of things. And notice that there's 6 soft ones and 5 hard ones. So there's more soft ones than there are hard ones. If you look across the top, look at the 4 competencies, it seems to me that 1 and 2 are kind of the hard stuff, sort of. Maybe 2 is a little bit soft, I don't know. But definitely 3 and 4, we as engineers would at least say those are soft. In other words, there's not a differential equation wrapped around it. One thing that I noticed too is when we talk about closing the loop and all working together on this, one of the things we need to always try to get a handle on is what is our constituencies telling us. And in our particular case, it starts from parents, students, the top employers. What are employers telling us? And I think you can ask almost everyone. They tell us that the hard stuff, the math, doing so well, is the soft stuff. That is effective communications. It almost always comes up as a shortcoming. Ethical leadership in a global and diverse society. In engineering, it's just incredible how important that is now. I mean, companies basically are diverse. Companies are sitting out in Dubai because of tax implications and all of these things that you have to learn how to communicate in different languages and be able to communicate with people who speak funny and have different customs and want to take siestas at 2 o'clock and all these kinds of things. And to the extent that we know these things are important, I think right now I don't see that information being fed back down to the lower levels to sort of make for sure that our students really do understand how important it is when they take writing courses or when they look at global and diverse issues. It is so important.
I'm just going to follow up on one of his comments was he mentioned constituencies, and I was just sitting here thinking about what I would do to try to facilitate communication. And as an assessment liaison, what I think would be really helpful is for us to figure out what each group type of people, what they need to do in response to these kinds of things. Because I think part of what happens is a faculty member hears what needs to be done at the university level, and they go, I'm not involved in that, or I can't address that. So somehow clearly articulating what each of our roles is in the closing the loop process.
I was going to say, this is one that I have one of my most specific answers. And so the question, how do we coordinate? My answer is really simple. We should have an assessment advisory committee that is at the university level, and the members of that committee ought to serve on all of the other committees. So there should be an assessment panel. Someone from that one ought to be on the teaching and learning roadmap. Someone ought to be on the research roadmap. Someone ought to be on the core curriculum council. And finally, there might actually be some common conversations.
I just wanted to comment on something on Walt's chart here, because this is wonderful, and I'm going to ask your permission to share this a little more widely. One of the things that we've come up against, or come up to, in our assessment of academic advising is that our advisors don't understand the purpose of the core curriculum. And so, therefore, they're not adequately or even explaining it to students. They're just saying you have to get these classes out of the way. But what I found about a year ago at a AAC&U conference, a conversation similar to what you just shared, was that if you go back to the professional standards for most professions, this is what you see. 5 very specific technical related to the field, and the rest of them, things that have to do with human interaction, the ability to learn as you grow, those sorts of things. And so I came back and to each of the 3 involved in our pilot assessment project, I said, go back and find those standards, and it just changed everything. So this is great. If you don't mind, I will share this with the engineering people involved in the program, so that when they talk to students, they have a real good understanding of the reason we have that.
Well, and I think the importance of the general ed requirements, even though we look at, for example, the first math course is sort of like not being all that important, but it is. It is. And the writing courses are all very important, because how students are taught and what they're taught and the importance of what they're taught sets the stage for later in the junior and senior years. Also, there's really very good correlation between how well students are doing in the gen ed courses and how they will generally perform in the higher level courses.
Next steps, all right. As a faculty member, I think it's important that faculty members be thoroughly briefed as to what this process is all about. And I think they need to know where they fit into this accreditation and the assessment process happens to be. And it's because it's going to be necessary, because when we do use these assessment tools that we have in the package that the committee is offering up to the university as a way to, as a metric for some of these things, that if we find out we're not doing a good job, which as I understand assessment is okay to find out, but then we have to take steps to rectify it, that it's not necessarily a fault of faculty members. It can be something as easy as the timing of when material is presented, or the way it's presented in the size of classes and other sorts of things that may actually benefit faculty members in their pedagogical approaches to teaching. So I would think that one of the important steps is to map out a strategy to bring the faculty aboard this process. And it's really hard. And I think it can't start soon enough. But somehow we've got to have a mechanism that doesn't sound like, oh my God, this is just more on top of more on top of more, at a time when faculty members are already under a lot of pressure in this day and age, especially younger faculty members. So I would say one of the first steps that this proposed committee ought to take on is a way to package this in a way to present it to faculty so that it is it is not something they can blow off, but something that they will benefit by participating in. And I think that's really, really a critical step.
Which one?
This proposed master committee.
Okay.
Well, and I'd like to throw out a thought about doing something similar for our students. I think one of the biggest issues about having expectations of students is for them to know what those expectations are. And I don't think that our students have, as you said, have a clue what, you know, the core curriculum expectations are. They just take classes because somebody told them to. And so even something as simple as an hour freshman seminar that's required, or each department or college could come up with something that's specific, but as a basis for your education is you find out what you're supposed to be like when you get out, or what's expected of you by the end of your program.
Let me second what Doug is saying. To some extent, we're at this university sort of like where we were at A&M at Qatar, really just starting from ground level zero. And 15 trips later, you're still trying to convince the faculty that what they're doing is really fun stuff. But it is important. Not only did I have to inform the faculty of what's required, what's expected of them, how they fit in, I also tried to educate them on how they benefited, how they can better their courses, how assessment can actually help them, as opposed to this big ominous thing. I also told them that, look, we also know that closing the loop doesn't mean you have to assess everything. I mean, many good universities do good close-the-loop stuff without having reams of assessment sitting behind it as to why they did it. So it's really important, and I agree with Doug. It's just very important.
Tiny plug for the assessment conference coming up, because we're actually what I'm going to talk about is what I'm going to talk about is a plan that I think has been working fairly well. So I'll even tell you guys more about that if you want to know. But in addition to the coordination part with the assessment advisory committee and representation, I have the word marketing written down as my answer to this. There's a really consistent message. Sometimes it would be as simple as everywhere you go, those 4 competencies are listed. So it's flying before students on the screen before they take their classes. It's on the university's website. It's everywhere they turn around until everybody's sick of it, but can actually name all 4 of them. So sometimes it's a really simple answer. Just stay on message and say it all the time.
And I'm not sure if this is a question or just an observation. Hopefully that it's something that we can pay attention to. I work with first-year students and with preparing faculty who will be working with first-year students. I've also worked with seniors, and so I've asked them about, do they know what the university's expectations are of them? And part of what we've worked on, I work closely with Deborah Fowler on some of this. First-year students get so many different sets of expectations thrown at them. So as I hear what you're saying, you're also mixing ABET with the core competencies, which is fine. It makes sense to us. To a student, it sounds like Charlie Brown's adults. Want, 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 want. It's whatever is most pressing at the moment is what they'll respond to. When they come in, what is important? The core values of the university, which are 6. Is it the Aggie Code? Is it ABET? Is it the class that they're in at the moment? Is it the core competencies? We're not even clear on that and how we're communicating it. We just talked about that. So that's part of what I would ask whoever's working on these various roadmaps, committees, and then again this group here who's working directly in their colleges to think about, because we're all saying all those things, but that's what they're hearing is a lot of different expectations at the same time. And not knowing how to coordinate that. Which one do I prioritize?
I'm not really surprised by your comments because I actually agree with them. One of the problems we have at this institution is we've been around a long time, so we've got a lot of momentum. We've been doing stuff forever, and assessment is kind of a new thing, really, for a lot of folks. And so even for students, they're sort of wondering, why are we doing this stuff? And we just kind of blow it off. it was a unique experience at Cutter because everybody was fresh. The students were fresh. Everybody was fresh. So it was like, we starting from ground level zero. So it actually made it a lot easier.
Our laws require our institutions every 5 years to report on core curriculum assessment. So Texas A&M, the last time they did this was '04, and Dr. Doug Slack was heavily involved in that process at that time. And so I was doing the math going, golly gee, it is 2009 and that law should be kicking in here any month now. And gee, I think I'm going to find out about that because I haven't heard a thing and I'm a little worried. So in my efforts to figure out what should happen with that '09 report that I was thinking would need to occur, I was delighted to discover something that I've been concerned about for some time now, and that is that the state of Texas is going to be coordinating with SAC's time frames so that institutions aren't doing one core curriculum report for SACs and another for the state. And I was so pleased to hear that. So for us, that would mean in 2011 or 12, we would submit our report to the state as well as to SACs pretty much at the same time. And they are taking seriously at the state, according to this email communication I had with the gal that's coming to the conference and presenting on all of this, that they're taking seriously the notion that SACS has related to outcomes, the state's talking and trying to talk in that language as well. So I was really reassured by that, and to know that that would be the case. I was also happy to know there won't be an '09 report that's due, which was something I was worried about. So at any rate, I just wanted to share that because it's not often that bureaucracies align with the stars or anything, but that was sure good news, I thought. And the last question, I have a question for the panel, and I know it's time, but dadgummit, I've been just burning over here with this one. Everybody keeps saying communicate, which I think is really great. But I was trying to think about, within an organization, especially the size and complexity of our Texas A&M organization, there's communication across lines, and then there's communications that go up, and there's also communications that go down. And I think the only kinds of communications I was hearing us discuss today were those across lines communications, but I wasn't hearing these communications. And as a servant of institutional assessment, sometimes I know that most of the work I get done is through the goodwill of our liaisons and just the fact that everybody knows what the job is and they take care of things. But in what ways would we expect to see within an organization the size and complexity of Texas A&M the sorts of communications that would go up and down the hierarchy of the institution?
I think that the important coordination happens this way, or the important communication, let's say, does happen this way. But the other has to go to, or otherwise, because these are the people who are going to ultimately be responsible, and these are the people who actually are going to have to do the stuff. So I think sometimes you can use a certain bureaucratic structure to be helpful. So if we say there's this big advisory committee, each person on all of these other committees must include one of these people. All of them must report back to this person, and that one reports up and these report down. I mean, I think sometimes you have to put it in the structure of the reporting mechanism, as well as just blanket the campus with this kind of stuff. But also, if you know what you're doing, you put it together and you speak loudly, it's kind of remarkable how often it just gets reported. So sometimes you have to, there are ways to get reports to the provost without actually calling him up or sending him an email message. So maybe that's.
And I'd like to say that this takes us right back to that chart, which is that if you try to move up and down in that chart, you get off this way, or you get back where you started, or and although I agree with you about talking loudly and things getting heard, I think part of the problem with moving up and down is having too many voices going up and down, and so your point, yes, your point of saying which voices feed into which spot that can then go up or down, I think is the critical aspect, which is what we don't have in our organizational structure.
Let me make an analogy comparing the university to the College of Engineering. Almost every 6 years, we go through ABET accreditation. Some have to go every 2 years if they haven't quite done their job right because they get partial accreditation. The importance of ABET accreditation really has to be understood by the dean. The dean does not really appreciate how important it is, and that's a problem. The faculty have to then understand what it is that's important about ABET. But one of the things we do is every 6 years a new person cycles in and does the ABET accreditation for each one of the 17 engineering programs that we have to accredit. And we reinvent the wheel over and over, and we have to convince them over. And so how do you get around all this? Well, one of the things that is really important, say at the departmental level, if you're going to do accreditation, you must have a very good plan. You must have a plan that's written down that says you will do this on these dates, these people are responsible, and therefore it becomes less independent of who cycles in and out. You at least have a plan. But you do have to have commitment at every level, because I think if you don't, you will always find those departments that say, well, I'm not going to do it. I don't care about it. And then it just takes the dean to remind them, hey, this is important.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Really thank the panel, and this conversation's probably been the most helpful for me personally. So thank you.